Hello and welcome.
Hello.
I expect we'll have people continue to join, but I did want to get us started pretty much right on time. As we go through, Rod's going to do a quick introduction just to the topic for today and maybe some general information, and then we'll just go through with any questions and answer questions the best that we can and take it from there. So on behalf of Delaware-Otsego Audubon Society and our photography chat session 2, I introduce you to Rod Sutton, fellow board member and photographer and naturalist.
Hi, everyone. Topic tonight is exposure, and it can either be simplified. The concept behind it is really not very complicated at all, but like so many things, the devil's in the details. There are so many variables connected with it that are a part of it, that if you get into specifics, a certain situation, depending on what those variables are, it can be very hard to explain. But the basic concept is that you have the amount of light entering the camera, which is controlled by a thing called the iris diaphragm. It's just like the iris diaphragm in your eye. It opens and closes depending on how much light there is. If you're in a dark room and you go outside in the bright sunlight, what does your eye, the iris diaphragm in your eye do? It closes down, compensate for the greater light. The other factor affecting
Oops. Wait a minute, I messed up. I muted you by accident, Rod. Can you go back?
I see that.
Okay.
Am I okay now?
Yep, you're good. Apologies on that. I was trying to mute other participants just so that it didn't interfere with that for now. And then people, when we ask questions, can unmute themselves and go from there.
Okay.
And I'm looking, I know it looks like Janice may be having some problems connecting with audio and video. So hopefully she'll be able to get in there soon. So sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
So there's the aperture, which controls the amount of light that can pass through the lens to the film or to the sensor. The other control is duration, which is controlled by the shutter speed. And typical full shutter speeds go from 1 second to a half a second to a quarter of a second to an eighth to a 15th and so on. Notice that each one is cutting, as I express it, is cutting the duration in half, which that's very important, understanding that it's cutting the duration or the time that the sensor is exposed to light by half. Or if you go the other way, that was a weird noise. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
The aperture numbers, as I said, are actually expressions of a fraction. So an aperture of 5.6 is actually a ratio, and you can express that as 1 over 5.6. The full aperture numbers start at 1, which is very rarely used in the camera, but occasionally it is. That's the widest aperture that you'll find. That would mean that a 50 millimeter lens has an aperture that's 50 millimeters wide. So the ratio is 1 to 1. F2 would mean that a 50 millimeter lens has an opening 25 millimeters wide. So that's the ratio it's expressing. You don't have to remember that. But the thing that's helpful to understand is that when you go from 1 to 1.4 to 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32, and on. Each one of those numbers is, depending on which way you're going on that scale, either doubling or cutting in half the amount of light reaching the sensor in your camera. In the same way that the shutter speed is controlling the amount of light reaching the sensor in your camera by either doubling it and cutting it in half. It's much easier to show you on paper than it is to explain it, but it's just an example. If you had an aperture number of 5.6 and a shutter speed of a 60th of a second, and you move the aperture from 5.6 to 4, you'd be doubling the amount of light reaching the sensor. But if you moved the shutter speed, which was a 60th of a second, to 1/25th, which is the next full shutter speed, you'd be cutting the light in half. So if you double something and then you cut it in half, you have the same thing you had before. So that's the relationship between those two things. They're part of what's called the exposure triad. And the exposure triad is basically just a rectangle. And the three sides of it include the shutter speed on one side, the aperture on another, and the third is the ISO number, which refers to the sensitivity that you're using with the given camera. So the interesting thing about that is it either doubles or cuts in half the sensitivity. So if you go from ISO 200 to 100, you're decreasing the sensitivity to 1/2 of what it was at 200. And if you go from 200 to 400, you're doubling it compared to the ISO of 200. 400 is twice as sensitive as 100. So you could put this on a slide rule and match the things up really well. It's kind of a neat system. I explain to students the importance of understanding doubling something and cutting it in half. When we're in a room with, let's say 20 fluorescent lights overhead, if you turn off 10 of them, you cut the amount of light in half. If you're outside in the daytime, and on a nice bright sunny day, if you put a whole nother sun in the sky, it would be the same thing as doubling the amount of light. So that doubling and cutting in half makes a tremendous difference. That's a simplification of the exposure triad, what happens when you're selecting different settings for an exposure. I guess now would be a good time if there are questions about it, because I could go on and on about that, and it wouldn't be very effective unless I knew what you wanted to know.
I forgot to unmute. So if you have a question, you should have control to unmute your microphone and ask a question. We do have one from Suzanne. So Suzanne, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I just wondered if you were talking film or digital, because I didn't think ISO played a part with digital.
Well, yes and no. ISO numbers are still used, but it's not quite the same dynamic with film. Film at 200 was twice as sensitive to light as 100. With camera sensors, it's not that the sensor is actually twice, it's the same sensor. So it doesn't actually get twice as sensitive. But the way that it computes and handles the photons turning into electrons, it's multiplied digitally so that it does come up with a number that they use ISO number that they assign representing the increased signal that's being electrically transmitted to the memory of the camera.
So with
So
the
it-
digital cameras you talked about last time, are you able to change the ISO number, or is that a number that's assigned based on the camera that you select?
Well, each camera comes with a native, what they call a native ISO. You don't need to remember that.
Okay.
But if your camera comes with a native ISO of 100, that is the thing that's actually designed into the camera. And that would be somewhat like ISO 100 film. ISO 100 film is designed as ISO 100 film. They can multiply that signal times 2 to make ISO 200. So as you go up higher in ISO numbers, they're multiplying the signal electronically to get a digitally higher number. Could you repeat that question? I got away from it.
Back in the film days, I used to buy different films, different film speeds for different environments. But with digital, I didn't know that you could change. Can you change the native ISO of a camera?
But you can't change the native ISO because that's the electronics that's built into it. But yes, you can change the ISO number. I don't want to say that you can on every camera, but I've yet to see one where you can't.
Okay.
I just bought my daughter a bridge camera. Bridge cameras I talked about a little bit about last week, and one of the things I wanted to mention that I forgot is they come with 2 different sensors, a small one and a large one. And the large one gives better quality. But her camera has the smaller one, a little bit bigger than you'd find in a cell phone, but it comes with a wide angle to telephoto lens. The telephoto end of it is equivalent to a 600 millimeter lens, which is really big in photography. And the camera's only that big. But you can set the ISO on it. It has numerous functions. It won't give us high quality picture as some of the cameras that I use. It costs a lot less, and it's a lot lighter. It has a lot of capabilities, particularly if you're going to post to a website. Because if you put it online, you're not going to see the difference in quality between what I bought for her and what I use myself. They'll be displayed the same way. But most cameras, just to reiterate, I haven't seen a camera yet where you can't set the ISO number. Now, how you set it varies wildly from camera to camera. And I think just about all the cameras, the digital cameras that I use, you can actually set it for auto ISO, where it'll automatically change the ISO number based upon the shutter speed and aperture they're chosen.
Rod, we have a question from Judy, who was interested in knowing what kind of camera you got your daughter.
Oh,
And that's from Margie too. So which bridge camera, and people that are in the market, you have expertise. You invested in this for your daughter as a good camera. So that's a really, I think, pertinent to what people want to know.
sure. I bought her that camera because it's cheap. It has good ratings. By cheap, I think it was 300 something. And it's got a wide angle to telephoto lens, which stays at 2.8. Most lenses, as you zoom into the subject, the aperture number changes. On the cameras that don't, you're looking at spending thousands of dollars. But as you zoom into your subject, the image projected out of the back of the lens onto the sensor spreads out so there's less light there. So to make, my daughter's lens, there has to be compensation built into the lens for that phenomenon. So it's one of the few cameras that can do that. She isn't too interested in making big enlargements. I bought her a Panasonic Lumix, Lumix, FZ300. Like I said, it's a little over $300. A number of sites online listed it as the top camera. Probably part of that was based upon the cost. A camera that I would look at has a larger sensor, 1-inch sensor, and that's a Panasonic Lumix FZ 1000 or 2000. That's quite a bit more money, and it doesn't have a zoom range. It only goes up to the equivalent of a 400 millimeter lens, but it gives higher quality images. So like so many things in life, everything's a trade-off. You get a real good camera with a real good lens, and the trade-off is that it will probably cost you $12,000 for the lens and $6,000 for the camera, and you won't want to carry it very far because it's really heavy. You have to put it on a tripod. With my daughter's camera, the one I bought for her, it's really light. I mean, it's only that big. It came in a box like that. It has phenomenal capability. Based on any criteria. The trade-off is that it has a small sensor, and it isn't capable of giving the same type of quality that a large sensor camera can give. So that's the trade-off. But it costs $300 and something instead of, going on 20 grand.
We have another question also from Suzanne. Can you do macro with any of those Panasonic Lumix cameras?
I believe, I just took it down to my daughter this afternoon. All I did was put a battery in it and made sure it would work. But it has close focusing capability. A true macro lens, the definition of a macro lens is the ability to take one-on-one ratio with a camera. So if you photographed a penny, the image that reaches the sensor would be the same size as the penny. So 1-to-1 ratio, that's what a true macro is. Most cameras that have what they call a macro capability aren't true macro lenses. They're close focusing lenses that you can get close, where you can get close to the subject. And what one company calls close focusing isn't necessarily what another company is going to call close focusing. But most of the bridge cameras and some of the other lenses for digital SLRs have close focusing capability. But it's not true macro. They're just misusing the name. If you want to get closer than 1-to-1, you're in a range called a micro. And those cameras are producing on the sensor something 2 to 4 times the real life size of the object. They're very limited in what you can use them for. But if you like to photograph the eyes of spiders, that would be the thing to get.
We have another question, Rod, from Joanna. For photographing birds, when do you recommend shooting in aperture priority versus shutter priority? Does weather play a role in which you choose or something else?
That's a tricky question because there are 2 ways you can go about it. But those 2 ways are pretty easy to understand. A short duration shutter speed freezes action. If you leave the shutter, if you're photographing a waterfall and you use a shutter speed of 1/8 of a second, you've probably seen the result in pictures in a magazine. The water looks creamy. It looks like a veil. It's smooth. If you photograph at a very fast shutter speed, you'll actually see the drops of water as they splash off of rocks. So if you want to freeze action, you want to use a fast shutter speed. So in that case, I would use the fastest shutter speed possible. but I would use aperture priority. I would open the aperture all the way up. The way I would do it is I would open the aperture all the way up and let the camera set the shutter speed. Because that way it'll always be using the fastest shutter speed it can under that condition. If you want to freeze the wings on a hummingbird, they go so fast, you can't freeze them with a shutter speed. An 8,000th of a second might get close, but I would use a flash. And a lot of people use flash for photographing. A lot of professional bird photographers. The really good bird photographers use a device that attaches to the flash that has a Fresnel lens on it. And I can't think of the name of the manufacturer now, but it focuses the flash, which would ordinarily cover a wide area, like if you were taking pictures of a room, would be wide, and it focuses it down like that. So all the light from the flash is going to one spot. So because the light's more concentrated, you can photograph a bird much further away and still get a decent exposure. When you're using a flash, this is what happened. Without the flash, the shutter opens, the shutter closes, and that's the duration of the exposure. When you're using a flash, you typically use it when there's not enough light. So what happens is the shutter opens, but it's not making exposure. The flash turns on and the flash turns off, and then the shutter closes. So the actual duration of the exposure is the time that the flash is on, not the time the shutter is open. And that works really well for something where you want to freeze action. The photographs you see of where you have a glass of milk and there's a drop of milk going into it, and you see the drop go in, then you see a little splash up, like a little droplet above it. You've probably seen pictures like that. Those pictures are taken with flash because the duration's so short. You can freeze that little splash mid-air. So if the bird is sitting still on a branch, I would want greater depth of field. And depth of field is refers to the distance in front of and behind the subject that's held in acceptable focus. You can use it for selective focus. The thing that's key to that is that light coming through a lens is a prism. So the lens is bent. It comes into the lens, then it gets bent, and where it crosses is the focal point. If you were in a totally dark room and you pointed the pen light at a camera with a shutter open, you would expect to see a little white dot. If it's out of focus, that white dot will be a big fuzzy dot because that little point of light is turned into something they call a circle confusion. It's out of focus, it's unresolved. As you focus the lens, which is moving the glass back and forth, it takes those rays of light and brings them to a point of focus at the sensor. Anything in front of or behind that point is technically not in focus. But when you refer to depth of field, you're referring to whether it appears to be an acceptable focus. Although there's only one point, there's an area in front of and behind that is in acceptable focus. So right now, if the camera is focusing on the tip of my nose, I don't know where it's focusing on my face, technically my ears are out of focus. But because of depth of field, they look sharper. They look sharp enough. And that's true with any of it. You get more depth of field with a wide angle lens than you do a telephoto lens because of the physics of the geometry of the optics. With a telephoto lens, you get less depth of field. Now, some of the bridge cameras go up to 2,000 and 3,000 millimeter focal length, but the depth of field there is so shallow, it probably isn't any wider than the depth of a playing card, the thickness of a playing card. So focus has to be exact, and it's very hard to look through a lens and tell if something's that exactly in focus. So in a practical sense, up to 800 millimeter equivalent focal length, and most cameras have an equivalent focal length. 800 is about as useful as I think you can get.
Great. I guess if we have any other questions, does anybody have a question? You want to unmute and ask a question?
If I were going out to photograph birds in nature, I've been trying for the last 2 weeks to get a picture of a hummingbird by my bird feeder using strobes. And I can never get it to tell, if I get too close to the bird feeder, it won't come near there. So I have to go a long way back. So I have to use a telephoto lens, which has a narrow depth of field. It also has a narrow angle of view. So quite often the hummingbird will be here and I can't find it through the lens. I also have to use a flash to try and freeze the action. But to get the flash to fire with the right shutter speed, with the right aperture, with a bird in the picture, it is a heck of a challenge. We had a guest speaker at the Audubon Society, I think it was last year, Costa Rica trip. Do you remember that? I don't remember the couple's name.
I do remember that. Was that the Doas?
Yeah, that sort of sounds.
Okay, Gail and Nelson?
Yeah, they went on a photo tour,
Yeah.
Costa Rica. And there was one place they went where they had a setup. It looked like it was out on like a deck you'd see on a restaurant. And they had it all set up with the strobe lights, flash units, different flash units. And I don't know the specifics of how they did it, but you could go there with your camera and everything was all set up for you. You didn't have to experiment. They have more than one species of hummingbird, but they got some great pictures of hummingbirds by something that was prearranged and was all set up for them to just step into. Configuring it at yourself is a lot of trial and error. But if I were going out to photograph, well, I've been, this spring I was photographing great blue herons at a rookery and two juvenile eagles in a nest. For some of the pictures, I used a 600 millimeter lens with what's called a 1.4 extender on it, which brought the focal length as, I think it's 960 millimeters. Very, very hard to use. Very hard to tell when you've got something in focus. The pictures are sharp when you get it in focus because they're really expensive lenses. But even then it was hard to get a tight shot on any of them. I had to use a tripod, I had to use a heavy tripod, and I had to use a light stand under the front of the lens to brace it because every time there was any breeze at all, the front of the lens would vibrate. So the longer the lens, the harder it is to use. 300 to 600 millimeter equivalent is the most useful range, I believe, for photographing wildlife. Getting closer is always better for the picture, not necessarily for the animal's well-being. So that's a trade-off too.
Rod, I was thinking, what would be a good next topic? Like, are there questions that people here in our group tonight might have that, you know, you'd like to focus on for the next session?
Well, I think that, you know, I don't know how many times I've been asked this question. It's the same question with the same scenario, but I've been teaching photography since 1977. And every 2 years, somebody says, well, I went on a trip to Alaska and I took pictures of the mountains and they came out really tiny. They didn't look like mountains at all. They looked like bumps. Well, telephoto lenses really just magnify the image on the frame, whether it's film or a sensor. They don't actually bring things closer, but they compact the distance between you and the subject. So it appears to bring them in closer. Well, the people that asked me that question wanted to get the whole mountain range in the picture. So they used a wide-angle lens. And a wide-angle lens expands the perception of distance. A telephoto lens compresses the impression of distance. I used to have people, I'd put a fisheye lens on the camera and tell them to look down at their feet and try to walk. And they would have a hard time walking because with that lens, it made them seem were twice as tall as they really were. If you use a wide angle, extremely wide angle lens on somebody's face, their nose will be big and their ears will be tiny. In photographing fashion models, they always use a moderately telephoto lens because it compresses the space between the nose and the ear. It's more flattering. I think that lens selection, aperture, and shutter speed and ISO in conjunction with that is where most people find the challenge. If you think about what the picture means, I took a master's class in the 80s, and it was a really in-depth class, and it was more about understanding images and the psychological impact of images. And going back to the mountains in Alaska, think about what you're trying to do. What does a mountain represent? Strength, size, immovability, power. So you select a wide angle lens, which diminishes all of that. And the end result is something that doesn't meet your objective in taking the picture. So one of the first things that I wrote down for Susan on, we made a list of different potential topics, is the most important decision. What do you want the picture to do? What are you trying to do? If you're trying to show pictures of your vacation to your family, you're trying to inform them on what you did by sharing. If you're doing a presentation at our annual dinner in October, you're trying to educate and inform by sharing your images. And you go about that has different criteria than taking pictures to show your family. We had an eagle release this weekend up in Cobleskill for an eagle that had been shot. So it had lead poisoning, it had a broken ulna in its wing, and it was in rehab with a rehabilitator for a number of months. I think it was like 9 or something like that. I don't recall exactly. But the pictures that I took were specifically to show the release. I didn't really try to get any of it flying away. I could get pictures of eagles flying away anytime. I tried to get some showing just the hands and the eagle in the person's hands being released. So that was my objective. So I chose a lens. I had a number of lenses with me, but I chose a lens that would work best for meeting that objective.
So maybe for our following sessions, maybe the next step would be to look at some real world, bird photography scenarios. Really sunny day, trying to find a little warbler amidst, sunspots in green trees versus a cloudy day, like those types of guidance pieces.
You brought up a real good point that I hadn't thought of. There are 2 times a day, they're called the magic times, when you get the best pictures, dawn and dusk. Fortunately, that happens to be when most wildlife is active. Unfortunately, that's when you have the least amount of light to work. Pictures taken in the middle of the day cause harsh shadows. Highlights tend to wash out very easily. Taking pictures on Sunday, it would be almost impossible to get good exposure on the head and the darkest feathers or shadow in the picture. You're going to have to select one or the other. I shot in a RAW format, which is another good topic. Different type of file formats, and why a lot of photographers choose RAW over JPEG. That's usually the choice that you have in a camera. Not always, but in the $300 camera I bought for my daughter, it is capable of recording RAW. RAW has been called the digital equivalent of a negative that contains all the information, and where the JPEG or the TIFF file would be the print. So it just gives you a lot more information to work with. And if you try to shoot in the JPEG mode on Sunday, it would have been pretty tricky trying to get a good exposure. The other topic is, which is really a fairly simple one, is composition. There are compositional rules. They aren't really rules, but they're guidelines. And they're based on they have a historical basis. On a line, there's something going back, I think, to the Greeks. It's called the golden segment on a line. And it's a certain point on a straight line where there's a certain ratio. You tend to find that ratio in nature. And if you looked at a seashell, what are those type that coil around? I can't think what they're.
Chambers?
A shell.
Yeah, those are chambers.
Yeah, but yeah. They generally go on that same ratio as they go out, as the golden segment. It's also called the golden rule. In painting and visual arts, it's called the rule of thirds. It's very easy to use. So that might be a topic.
That sounds good. And people have chatted in some extra ideas for us as we go along. I don't want to keep us, because I know we want to keep to a fairly good time schedule. I thank you all very, very much for coming tonight, and we'll continue in 2 weeks. I'll go ahead and just send an email reminder out for everyone who attended tonight for next week, so that once we've got the information set up there, you should be able to go right in and register. And then actually, you might be able to do it now through the same information. I'm trying to change it so that you don't have to register every time. You can just come. So that may generate new information for the meeting structure. So you may get like a notification, like that you can now register once for all the sessions. Rod, yep.
Yeah, I just have a question for you, Susan. If people have specific questions, if they can email them to you and you could forward them to me, I
Yep.
can, if I have their email address, I will answer them in the email, and I can give a better explanation than I can.
Yeah,
And I have-
that sounds great. And I'm certainly open to that. The other option is we can just compile some of those if there are things
That's
that
fine.
everybody can benefit from. We'll go through the questions that have been submitted and answer those as part of our session. And then if it's more complicated, then I think that, you know, answering them individually is probably a better idea. Because the hard part with this format is everybody's at a different place. So trying to, you know, direct the content where it's meaningful across the board is a challenge, which is why I think it's nice just to have it informal and ask and answer questions with a little bit of guidance just on topic. I'd also, like, as we do like those real world scenario types of things, I just want to touch on like birding ethics and photography ethics in the field as well, just because I think that's a really important part of any kind of wildlife photography. So for now, I'm going to say thank you, Rod, because this was good, and I hope that everybody's, you know, getting something out of it. We're happy to continue to do it, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you all in another 2 weeks. Anything final before we go ahead and close out the meeting?
I don't know if you could give this some thought. I don't know if there's any way to do it, but if there were some way of people submitting pictures that they have questions about. Not a critique. I don't critique what somebody's doing.
We could add, we have a form on the website to upload your images and send us a message. So we could probably just use that form, and we would receive those by email, and I could forward those over. So we could certainly do that. And then we could share them, you know, share them online too. We can do screen share. Good.
Thank
Well,
you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. And happy to take any feedback. Go ahead, just message me.